Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Morrison, Cook County Commissioner of the 15th District, representing the Northwest Suburbs. I wanted to thank you all for joining our town hall on the Residential Tenant and Landlord Ordinance, or RTLO. We have incredible guests with us this evening who will discuss Cook County's RTLO and what renters in suburban Cook County need to know before this critical ordinance goes into full effect on June 1st. I was proud to be a chief co-sponsor of this ordinance alongside my friend and colleague, Commissioner Scott Britton. Commissioner Britton and I, and many of the advocates joining us tonight, started crafting the RTLO more than 2 years ago after we saw firsthand some of the housing conditions in the suburbs. We knew we needed to do more to protect suburban renters, and I'm happy that after working tirelessly, we were successful in securing the protections our Cook County residents desperately needed and deserved. Tonight, we will give you an overview of this ordinance and discuss how the RTLO will affect you directly. We will have a question and answer portion during the second half of the town hall tonight. So if you have any questions, please post them in the Facebook comment section at any point during our conversation, and we will try to answer as many as possible. Thank you all again for joining us, and I'd like to now introduce and welcome my friend and colleague and other chief co-sponsor, Commissioner Scott Britton.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you for both your friendship and all your hard work in this very long process of getting the RTLO through the Cook County Board. I am Scott Britton. I'm the Cook County Commissioner of the 14th District, which is the north and northwest suburbs of Chicago. And before I started my board service in the county, I was an elected official in Glenview, and I worked on affordable housing issues and source of income issues, as the president is acquainted with. And I felt like we had more work to do, particularly as it relates to renters in suburban Cook County. That was the genesis of this particular ordinance and the work that we have done. But the work that we have done, and Kevin and I have spent a lot of time on trying to put this together, is really a testament to the work that's been done through the Cook County Board before our service began, in particular by our Cook County Board President, Toni Preckwinkle. The ideas of equity, justice, and fairness, which are a cornerstone of her administration, are reflected in this ordinance, which is a function of the attempt to be more fair for those without lawyers and lobbyists within Cook County, and particularly the suburbs. And so it is my very great pleasure to introduce to you our Cook County Board President, Toni Preckwinkle.
Well, good evening, and thank you very much to Commissioner Kevin Morrison and Commissioner Scott Britton for inviting me tonight. I really appreciate it, and I'm grateful to the two of you for sponsoring this important legislation. In January, the Board of Commissioners voted to approve the Residential Tenant Landlord Ordinance. So for more than a year, the Board of Commissioners worked diligently and struggled with difficult conversations concerning housing, justice, and protections afforded to our communities. We heard from housing advocates, from renters and landlords, and community residents as we developed solutions to the issues our residents are facing. I appreciate their thoughtfulness and collaboration as we navigated these issues and proposed solutions. This resolution is set upon a backdrop of an affordable housing crisis that has been brewing for decades, issues that have only been magnified as we continue our fight against COVID-19. While these conversations are long overdue, they could not happen at a more pressing moment for our country. Issues of affordable housing have always been policy areas of interest to me. From my earliest days as an alderman in the city of Chicago, issues surrounding fair and affordable housing have been a priority of mine. Since taking this office in 2010, they have continued to be of great importance to me and have led to the passing of historic protections for our most vulnerable residents. From the passing of the Cook County Human Rights Ordinance that provided source of income protections to the recently passed Just Housing Ordinance, we have continued to work toward this end. The Residential Tenant Landlord Ordinance represents another step in our fight for fair housing. By clearly defining consistent obligations of both landlords and tenants across the county, lowering the cap on allowable late fees, and providing additional protections against property damage, among others, this is a fair deal for all our residents involved in the rental housing market. I'm grateful to all those involved in making Cook County a welcoming place to live. During this town hall event tonight, you'll hear from housing advocates and experts to answer some questions about this ordinance and how it will advance equity in suburban Cook County. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, President Preckwinkle. It is a true honor to have you here this evening, and I again thank you for all your support. After I was elected to the county board in 2018, I saw firsthand some of the poor living conditions suburban renters experience, especially low-income renters. I didn't think it was fair that renters in Chicago, Evanston, and Mount Prospect had protections while many suburban renters had to fight against unlawful lockouts and unfair landlord retaliation. We now know 43% of suburban Cook County residents are renters, and 64% of Cook County renters are low-income renters. We also know that people of color face greater barriers to securing housing. Renters of color are more cost-burdened, and neighborhoods with more renters of color have higher rates of eviction. We knew we needed to take action, so we spent countless hours meeting with landlord groups, housing advocates, and Cook County commissioners to hear all sides of the issue and make sure that we crafted an ordinance that protects the most at-risk suburban renters. The RTLO is a strong ordinance. It helps working families and suburban renters and only affects bad actor landlords. As a result of the RTLO, renters in more than 245,000 suburban households will be protected against landlord retaliation, unlawful lockouts, and excessive fees, among other things. Good landlords are already providing these basic protections. The RTLO simply safeguards tenants from bad actor landlords. With that, I'll pass it off to Commissioner Scott Britton.
Thank you, Kevin. So the first thing we can talk about is what exactly this ordinance covers, or who it covers and who it does not. We wanted to give landlords and tenants a chance to understand the provisions of this ordinance before it took effect. That's why the effective date is June 1st, except for the lockout provision, something we thought was essential to be put into law and to practice immediately, and it is now the law in suburban Cook County. There are a number of sections of the ordinance that exempt certain categories of landlords, and that was based on our conversations with landlord organizations and realtors. That includes the small mom and pop owners. Those are people who are owner-occupied buildings in 6 units or less. We've excluded SROs, single room occupancy. There's a reason for that because of the economics of it, to make sure they don't become prohibitively expensive. Hotels and dorms obviously are not covered. There was a very significant part of this that we discussed with a number of advocate groups on single family homes. My neighbor just recently had to go to a nursing home, and they're going to probably rent out her home for a while. If you've lived in the home for the last year, or a family member has, it will exempt your property under the terms of the RTLO. And that is, I think, an important exception that certainly the realtor groups really wanted put in, and we negotiated and placed in the ordinance. There are certain provisions which are now prohibited in lease terms in suburban Cook County. One of the ones that I was most offended by was the confession of judgment provisions. As a lawyer, confession of judgment runs against everything that I learned in law school. But you have a right to defend yourself in court. Confession of judgment basically means you give up. You sign a document that says, I'm guilty no matter what happens, and the facts are irrelevant. Also, the idea of giving out notice requirements and a right to a jury trial, all are very, I think, inappropriate and unacceptable, and now prohibited by the RTLO. I also was struck by seeing some lease agreements which basically said you couldn't say anything bad about your landlord. Now, it's not a First Amendment issue because it's not the government doing it, but I thought that seemed to be rife with problems. And also, sometimes you have to complain to get anything done, and I think that was also something that should be prohibited. We also, addressed the idea that, again, there is an unequal playing field frequently between landlord and tenant, and having an attorney fee provision where the tenant has to pay the landlord's attorney's fees didn't seem to be either fair or appropriate, and that is also prohibited under the ordinance. And the next section of this is going to deal with lockouts, and I'll introduce Lawrence Wood, who's a housing practice group supervisory attorney for Legal Aid Chicago. So Lawrence, you can take this one.
Thank you, Commissioner. As Commissioner Britton noted before, the ordinance's prohibition against lockouts is the one part of the ordinance that is in effect right now. You don't have to wait until June 1st. This has been in effect since January 1st of this year. A lockout is any attempt by a landlord to force a tenant out of a unit without authority of law. In Illinois, there is only one way you can force a tenant to leave a unit they're renting. And the process that you have to follow is set forth in what's called the Eviction Act. At a minimum, in most cases, you would have to first serve a notice of termination of tenancy. You'd certainly have to file an eviction action. You have to win the case. You have to get an eviction order, and then you have to pay the sheriff to enforce that order. And the sheriff enforces it in Cook County by changing the locks on the door. That is the only way that a landlord can force a tenant out of a unit. Unfortunately, we have seen that many landlords, especially during the pandemic, because they're frustrated with the moratorium against evictions, have tried to make an end run around the Eviction Act, and they've tried to force tenants out by changing or plugging the locks, removing doors or windows, disconnecting gas or electric service, or just threatening the tenants outright and telling them to move. The Eviction Act itself does prohibit lockouts, but it doesn't really have any teeth because it doesn't provide for damages. What's so wonderful about this new ordinance is that it states that if a tenant can establish that a landlord violated the prohibition against lockouts, then the tenant can get damages. These damages are equal to 2 months' rent or twice the actual damages sustained by the tenant, whichever is greater. They can also get their attorney's fees, and of course they can get an order requiring the landlord to restore the tenant to possession of their unit. So this is extremely important to me. I work for an agency that covers all of Cook County, but whenever we would get a lockout case that was outside of Chicago, our hearts would kind of sink because we knew it would be very difficult or more difficult to force the landlord to restore the tenant to possession because we didn't have much leverage. In many parts of suburban Cook County, we couldn't say if you don't restore the tenant to possession, then there are going to be these penalties assessed against you. But now we can say that, and this is an incredibly important protection. So we can move on to the next slide. The next section that I've been asked to talk about are notices that all tenants and landlords need to know about. The notices that I'm first going to talk about are the notices of the landlord's intent to terminate a tenancy. If the landlord wants to terminate the tenancy for non-payment of rent, then the landlord has to provide a notice stating the amount of rent due and giving the tenant 5 days to pay the amount due. This is the same as the requirement under state law. So that's not much different. And if the tenant does not pay the amount due before the termination notice expires, at that point, the landlord can file an eviction action. If the landlord wants to evict the tenant for some violation other than non-payment of rent, then state law says that the landlord has to give a 10-day notice describing the violation and letting the tenant know that the tenancy will be terminated within the next 10 days. What the ordinance does that is so important, and this is like the ordinance that we've had in Chicago, is it states that the notice must also inform the tenant of his right to cure the alleged lease violation before the notice expires, provided that the violation can be cured. And this is an incredibly important right for tenants, and it really does not impose any undue burdens on the landlord because it does give the tenant the right to cure, but only if the tenant does effect an actual cure, so that there would be no harm to the landlord. There would be no need to proceed with the eviction action. If the landlord wants to terminate the lease agreement but not because the tenant has committed any violation. The landlord can provide notice of his intent to not renew the lease. But the ordinance says that the landlord has to give the tenant at least 60 days advance written notice. Okay, and then the landlord can terminate the lease without good cause, but the tenant has to have good advance notice that this is happening so that they can relocate. I want to note that this is an especially important protection for the thousands of families who receive rental assistance under the Housing Choice Voucher Program. I'm not going to take much time to describe this program, but voucher holders live in units owned by private landlords, and they receive rental assistance while they're living in these units. The landlords do have a right, or the owners do have a right, to terminate the lease agreement without good cause at the end of the initial term or at the end of what we call any successive definite term. And the reason they're allowed to do that is because the family that can then get what are called moving papers and relocate to another assisted unit. But the relocation process takes time. And in the past, landlords have been allowed to terminate a lease agreement without good cause upon 30 days notice. And that does not give a voucher holder time to relocate to another assisted unit. This ordinance provision will. There's another notice provision regarding the removal of unvaluable abandoned property. I think that someone else is going to be talking about this in a little more detail, but if a landlord believes that the tenant has abandoned the unit and they have left property behind, but the property has no value, the landlord is allowed, excuse me, to provide 7 days notice and then dispose of that property. If the property has value, there are different notice provisions, which I think someone's going to explain in a little more detail. I'm happy to address it in more detail at the end of this presentation, but I don't want to use up more time than I've been allotted. The last notice that I want to talk about is the notice that a landlord has to provide if they want to enter the unit. The landlord has to provide at least 2 days advance written notice. And that's more of a protection even than the Chicago tenants are entitled to, because the Chicago ordinance says tenants are entitled to 2 days advance notice. It does not have to be written. But the Cook County ordinance says it does. And also the landlord is only able to enter the unit at reasonable hours between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. Now, obviously, the landlords are allowed to enter the unit without advance notice in an emergency, but in a non-emergency situation, landlords always have to provide 2 days advance written notice. And this is a very important protection that has been available, again, to Chicago residents for 35 years now, and it's about time that it's also provided to residents in suburban Cook County. At this point, I would like to introduce Sheila Sutton, who is a housing advocate with Housing Action Illinois, and she's going to take on the next part of the presentation.
Good evening. Thank you, Larry. So one of the important pieces of the Cook County Residential Tenant Landlord Ordinance is that it expressly states that you have the right to a habitable unit. A healthy home is critical to a healthy life. So one of the requirements that exist is that a landlord must provide a habitable and safe home, and that's defined in the RTLO to include maintaining essential services, then providing those essential services, including heat, running water, hot water, electricity, gas, and plumbing, that the rental agreement requires that the landlord provide. Additionally, if internet access is a portion of the rental agreement, that the landlord will also be required to make sure that that is provided as agreed in the lease. The landlord has to maintain the property according to the relevant local building codes. And also in the RTLO, adequate heat is defined as being available from September 1st through June 1st. That the heat has to be at least 68 degrees in the daytime. There's specific hours for that. And in the evening, the heat has to be at least 66 degrees. For the RTLO also addresses bed bugs. So tenants have the right to be free from bed bugs in their unit, and after providing the landlord with written notification, the landlord must provide pest control services within 10 days. Additionally, the landlord must continue to maintain records that are written of their pest control efforts for 3 years. Next slide, please. So landlords also are required to make timely repairs. The RTLO provides that if the landlord needs to enter a unit for an emergency repair, they do not need to provide a 48-hour notice. That would include, a massive leak, gas leak, something defined as an emergency. So the landlord has access to the unit for those purposes. Outside of that, that the notice requirement is 48 hours. The landlord also is required under the RTLO to make repairs within 14 days. If after that 14-day period is up, the tenant has to have given that request in writing and said that they would like this repaired within 14 days. The tenant has the right, after that 14-day period is up, if the landlord has not addressed that issue, to fix the issue themselves and or deduct a portion of their rent reflective of the diminished value of the unit. A tenant can never, ever, ever, just to say this out loud, a tenant can never, ever, ever withhold a full month's rent or all rent. That is not allowed under the RTLO or any law. So just want to make that clear. But what the RTLO does allow for is for the tenant to have a remedy available if the repair is not done in a timely manner. If you're a subsidized tenant, subsidized tenants have a different set of requirements. They have a secondary contract with their housing subsidy provider, and those agreements do not typically allow for people to withhold rent under any circumstances. So you'll need to, if you're experiencing this issue, you might want to access some of the resources that we've listed at the end of this presentation, if you're a subsidized tenant, regarding what is the best way for you to address issues with repairs. You can still write a letter to your landlord or write a notice, text them, put it in writing that you need those repairs in 14 days. You can actually get the repair fixed yourself, but how you recoup any finances or anything from that, you'll want to talk to someone in a legal aid position or someone who works with subsidized tenants to make sure that you don't do anything that jeopardizes your subsidy. So tenants also have responsibilities in the Residential Tenant Landlord Ordinance. The tenant, the tenant's family, and invited guests must comply with obligations in local municipal codes. They must keep their unit safe, use appliances and fixtures in a safe way, dispose of garbage, not deliberately damage or remove any property that, like you can't take your stove with you if you didn't pay for that stove. The stove belongs in the unit with the unit at all times. And then additionally, the tenant under the RTLO is required to maintain a peaceful coexistence or not disturb the other tenants as best as they possibly can under the RTLO. So those are some of the requirements. Those are some of the requirements for both landlords and tenants in terms of habitability, that safe and healthy home. Next, we talk about the RTLO and what happens if there is abandoned or destroyed property. So if the RTLO provides some new protections against property destruction in cases where property is damaged by the landlord or the tenants or the tenant's guest. How would a landlord determine if the unit is abandoned? So if the landlord believes the tenant has abandoned the unit, the landlord should and can try to rent that unit to someone else. And the landlord, if they decide the tenant has abandoned the unit, these are some of the ways they can determine that. If the tenant has given the landlord a written notice or has not been in the unit for 32 days, If they have removed their property and not paid rent, then the landlord can assume under the RTLO that the property is abandoned. So if that occurs, what should the landlord do with any items that are left behind? If there is property that is without value, it can be thrown away after 7 days without notice. If there is property that has value, the landlord must do their best to try to get notice to the tenant, understanding that if the last known address of that tenant is the property itself and the tenant has abandoned it, the landlord should try to call, text, find a way to do their best, send smoke signals, just kidding. But give the tenant a written notice that they're going to remove the property within 7 days, after which the landlord can sell the items left behind, and they should keep those proceeds for the tenant for 1 year.
Awesome. Thank you so very much, Sheila. Next, I'm going to talk about what the tenant's right to know are. We put several provisions in the RTLO that we call right to know provisions. These are things, in our opinion, that renters deserve to know before and after they move into a rental unit. For example, as a renter, you have the right to know the name and contact information of the property owner or manager. The owner or manager must also let you know if the building is sold. If you're paying utilities as a renter, the owner must give you an estimate of the utility costs for the past 12 months. The landlord must also let you know if the property has had any building code violations in the last year. And the landlord must let you know if the property has any known lead issues. One of the most critical things a renter deserves to know, and that housing advocates fought for, is a summary of the move-in fee. A landlord can charge a move-in fee, but the fee must be reasonable and related to the actual cost of moving in. The landlord must also detail how much it costs for a tenant to move in. Again, we put the right to know provision in the RTLO to make the move-in process and tenant and landlord relationship more transparent. We want to prevent landlords from overcharging tenants solely to make extra money. We believe renters deserve to know where the money is going and how the landlord plans to use it. If the landlord doesn't provide any of this information, you must give the landlord a notice of 2 business days and wait to see if the landlord shares it. If not, you may be able to end your lease. With that, I'll pass it off to Commissioner Britton.
I was muted. So thank you, Kevin. I want to make sure that we point out that this is not a one-way street. There are responsibilities, rules, and regulations that apply to tenants, just like they do in the Chicago ordinance and which they do in the suburban Cook County one. The first one is, a landlord does need to have the ability to get into a unit on occasion for a lot of different reasons, including life safety reasons. That is provided for in our ordinance, and that the landlord can give 2 days notice and enter on a reasonable time, not 3 o'clock in the morning, to make repairs or to do things that need to be done in order to keep the units safe. If it's an emergency, there are also provisions whereby they can take action at that point. Bed bugs are certainly an issue that sometimes arise. Those notice requirements are also contained within the ordinance as well. As Kevin already mentioned, the security deposit issue had become one that the advocate groups raised to us on a number of occasions, namely that the security deposit was being abrogated. Certainly it is in the city on occasion, and they're just emphasizing move-in fees which have nothing to do with moving into the unit. It's just really a security deposit that you don't get back, and that is not fair. So we've put this particular provision in, making it clear, and landlords wanted to make sure that we pointed this out, and we did in no uncertain terms, that you can have a security deposit in suburban Cook County under the RTLO. The only limitations are it has to be kept in a separate account, not commingled. It doesn't have to be kept in an identified account as to that particular renter. It can be in a general account, but it has to be identified as to where it is in case somebody needs to try and find out what happened to their money. And it can't be more than 1.5 times the monthly rent. Just as, Kevin and I discussed this yesterday on the Joan Esposito show, that also means that if you have a security deposit and someone trashes the unit, there are provisions whereby the landlord can use that money to make repairs. That makes sense. It is still allowed under the terms of the ordinance and something that's fair to landlords. Obviously, the tenants have to comply with all local ordinances and rules and regulations, reasonable rules that the landlord may impose, and those have not changed based on the terms of the ordinance. Obviously, you can't run your private business out of your unit if that's prohibited. That's typical of anywhere. And when it says be a friendly neighbor, you don't even have to be that friendly, but no drum playing at 3 o'clock in the morning, that kind of stuff is not acceptable. It wasn't acceptable before we passed this ordinance. It's not acceptable now. And obviously, as Sheila has indicated, we have a provision whereby we're going to make sure we preserve, but also can get rid of abandoned property in case it needs to be eliminated. The next slide is going to talk about one basic rule that I think landlord groups have been talking to me and to Kevin about, in that, you don't have to pay any rent anymore in suburban Cook County. That is absolutely not the case. You still have to pay your rent. But the point of the provisions in the RTLO, particularly as it relates to late fees, late fees can be incredibly punitive. And if you can't pay your rent, I would say 99% of the time it's because you don't have any money to pay your rent. It's not because you just don't feel like it. And honestly, piling that on, particularly for people on the lower end of our economic scale, like single mothers, people of color, a lot of different reasons why there are people who are unfortunately not being able to, because they lost their jobs, they can't pay their rent. Piling on excessive late fees just put those people in even deeper of a hole than they already are. There's no reason for it. But I also want to make clear that there is a way that if you're paying $5,000 a month for an apartment, your late fee can be 5% of that. It is not $10. That's only for the first 1,000. Landlords, can apply rent payments to the rent. They don't have to worry about other costs. The landlord, again, has to give a 5-day written notice, as is required by statute, for rent non-payment. And we do have a pay to stay provision, whereby if the tenant does not pay during that 5-day period, the landlord can file an eviction. Now, I know there's a lot of questions about moratoriums and suspension of evictions within Cook County and throughout the country. Again, when Kevin and I put this ordinance together, it was pre-COVID. So this did not arise out of the pandemic. It was based on other issues that existed before we had this particularly unpleasant disease in our midst. But there is now a provision for filing and paying before judgment to enable people, again, for the very basic rule and for the very basic goal of keeping people in their homes and preventing homelessness, something that Kevin and I have emphasized throughout this process, and one that we're going to continue to emphasize as we continue to serve. And I believe then Lawrence will be our next slide.
I'm sorry I was muted. I was just noting that I have 10 issues to get through in 5 minutes, so I've got about 30 seconds for each one, but some of this has been covered before. I did want to note that I misspoke when talking about the disposition of abandoned property, but Sheila got it right. If the landlord believes that the abandoned property has no value, the landlord does not have to provide written notice before disposing of that property. The written notice is required only if the abandoned property actually does have value. With respect to other tenants' rights, if they have been denied essential services, the tenant has several options in that case. The tenant does have to provide the landlord with notice of the problem, obviously. And if the landlord does not correct the notice within 24 hours, then the tenant is allowed to withhold from the rent an amount that reflects the reduced value of the apartment. As Sheila had mentioned before, you never want to withhold 100% of the rent that's owed. You can obtain the services that you need that have not been provided to you, that the landlord's responsible for, and deduct the cost of those services from the rent. You may also have an opportunity to terminate the lease agreement if the landlord is not providing services. If the landlord has not made necessary repairs after getting notice, as Sheila had mentioned before, you may have an opportunity to pay for the cost of minor repairs after giving written notice to your landlord, and then deduct the cost of those repairs from your rent. You may be able to withhold a percentage of the rent that comes due. Again, you've got to be very careful when you're doing that, because if you withhold too much money, the landlord may be able to try to evict you for non-payment of rent. So I urge people who are considering that option of withholding rent to reflect the reduced value of the premises to contact an attorney, so the attorney can help you calculate the correct amount that you should be withholding. If the landlord is failing to disclose information they're required to disclose, the landlords actually do have an opportunity to correct that defect. So the tenant has to notify them about the defect, and the landlord then has 2 days to correct it. We've already talked about bed bugs, but I did just want to note bed bugs have been a terrible problem before in Cook County, still a terrible problem in some units. Within 48 hours after discovering the bed bug problem, the tenant may notify the landlord in writing about the problem. And if the problem is not corrected within the next 2 business days, then the tenant may terminate the lease upon 30 days advance written notice. And the tenant may also file a civil suit against the landlord and recover damages and their attorney's fees, which is a very powerful remedy. I've already talked about illegal lockouts. There is a strict prohibition against lockouts, and there are very severe penalties that can be imposed against the landlord who violates the prohibition against lockouts. I've talked about unreasonable entry. Again, the landlord has to provide 48 hours advance written notice of his intent to enter the unit during reasonable hours, unless there's an emergency. In those cases, the landlord can come in without giving the requisite notice. As far as late rent, Commissioner Britton was talking about this, but this is another very important provision that now also exists in the Chicago Ordinance. If a tenant is facing eviction for non-payment of rent and they get the requisite 5-day notice and they don't pay the rent before the notice expires, at that point, the landlord may file an eviction action, but the ordinance gives tenants a very important protection. They may, at any time before an eviction order is entered, preserve their tenancy by paying all the rent due plus court costs plus filing fees, not attorney's fees, just court costs, which would be the filing fees and the service fees. So that right is extremely important, and it doesn't exist in most other parts of the country. If the landlord does not give the requisite 60-day notice to a tenant when they want to refuse to renew the lease agreement, the tenant doesn't get that notice. They get to stay in the unit for another 120 days. Just as there is a specific and very strong prohibition against illegal lockouts, there is also a very strong prohibition against retaliatory actions. So a landlord cannot refuse to renew a lease agreement, cannot threaten to terminate a tenancy, cannot refuse services or decrease services solely because a tenant has engaged in protected activity. And protected activity is very broadly defined in the Cook County Ordinance, just as it is in the Chicago Ordinance. And if the landlord violates the prohibition against retaliatory activity, it can be a defense in an eviction action. There are also penalties for violating the prohibition against retaliatory conduct. And correct me if I'm wrong, Commissioner, but I believe the penalties are the same as the penalties set forth in Chicago's ordinance, which would be 2 months rent plus attorney's fees. The last subject that I wanted to address has to do with security deposits. There are several security deposit provisions in the ordinance. If the landlord violates those provisions, the penalty is an amount equal to twice the security deposit. If the tenant sues for violation of the security deposit provisions and prevails, they are also entitled to their attorney's fees. I do want to say that I think the Cook County Ordinance, commissioners can speak to this as well, provides more protections than, let's say, the Chicago Ordinance does to landlords who unwittingly commit a violation of the security deposit provisions. And also, the issue regarding security deposits is kind of complicated now because the interest rate on security deposits is so low. But it is very important that landlords return security deposits to which the tenants are entitled. The landlords may, of course, withhold from the security deposit any unpaid rent. They may also withhold the cost of repairing damage that exceeds ordinary wear and tear. If the landlord does want to withhold the cost of repairing damage that exceeds ordinary wear and tear, then they must 30 days after the tenant moves out of the unit provide the tenant with an itemized list of the cost of repairs. But in the past, many landlords have withheld security deposits. They haven't. There's a lot of money at stake for tenants, so these provisions are very important. And I believe we can move on now to the next slide. All right. Again, if a tenant wants to go after a landlord for violating any of the provisions in the Cook County Tenant Landlord Ordinance, I urge them to at least seek the advice of an attorney. Many tenants cannot afford attorneys. As Commissioner Morrison noted, I think he said that 64% of the tenants in Cook County are low-income families, so many cannot afford an attorney, but there are services available, free services or services that can be provided at a reduced rate. I work for an organization called Legal Aid Chicago. We represent tenants throughout Cook County, so I would urge any tenants who have questions about their rights under the ordinance or are considering a lawsuit for a violation of the ordinance to call us. Our number is here on the PowerPoint. It's 312-341-1070. I would also urge tenants to call CARPLS, which is an advice and referral service. And CARPLS stands for Coordinated Advice and Referral Program for Legal Services. But you can call them and they can direct you to an attorney who can help you, either by giving you advice or by providing extended representation. There is another excellent organization called North Suburban Legal Aid. I know attorneys who work there, and their information is also here. And then, of course, there's the Cook County Legal Aid for Housing and Debt. So if you're trying to enforce your rights under the ordinance, or you believe that your landlord has violated your rights, then again, I urge you to at least speak to an attorney and take advantage of these resources.
Thank you so very much, Lawrence. I really appreciate it. Next, we're going to be moving on to our discussion portion of today's conversation. Again, for all of our viewers watching live, please submit your questions in the comments. I see we've got a lot of questions submitted already, and we're going to do as best we can to get them all answered. We are going to begin with pre-submitted questions, but I did want to address one that I saw just come in. It was a question concerning bed bugs. Now, I just wanted to clarify that with the current ordinance, landlords have 10 days to bring in an exterminator. So it's not that once being provided that notice, within that 2-day margin, that's when they have to actually request services, but they have 10 days to bring in an exterminator to get the pest issue under control. But next, I'm going to start with some of the pre-submitted questions. The first one that we have up is, what do we do when there is mold and mice in the home and the landlord won't do anything, but they want their rent on time? This question gets at issues of habitability. Sheila, can you take this one and talk about what a tenant can do under the ordinance with these circumstances?
Certainly. So In the case of mold or pest, those are repairs that the landlord is responsible for. Pest control services, attending to whatever is not just covering the mold with paint, but also ideally finding the root cause of whatever the problem is. So the tenant should provide the landlord in writing a letter stating that they would like the landlord to fix the specific issues with, and that should be a dated letter. It can be text. It should be written though. If the tenant usually engages the landlord in email or via some other portal or via text, that's a fine way to do that. Generally speaking, it's a good idea to try to send a follow-up letter of that particular request, a hard copy that the tenant keeps a copy of and sends to the landlord as well. But the tenant can write that letter, please fix this within 14 days. If you don't fix it within 14 days, the tenant has an option to, now this to be specific, the ordinance does say minor repairs. So we're looking at usually under $500 or a portion of the rent, whichever is more, is the top tier of what the repair could be. So if there's a large plumbing problem that a plumber would have to, that would cost $3,000 to fix, that's probably beyond the scope of what a tenant would pay for and then deduct from their rent. But if it's, let's say, getting some mouse traps to try to address the issue, saving those receipts, and then the tenant after 14 days, if the landlord has not responded to the request, could go purchase some mouse traps and then put that, have those receipts and get deduct that from the rent the following rental period, or they could deduct, as Larry said, the diminished value of the unit. But we always want to be careful when you do that, because what you don't want to do is say, my unit is diminished by 75%. So I'm only paying 25% of my rent based on this. That could be considered non-payment of rent under court of law. So you want to be conscientious of, making it a very small and reasonable amount, but really contacting one of the legal resources that Larry mentioned. The other really important piece to take away from this is that communication is documentation for you as the tenant and for the landlord to have a clear set of understanding. I'm asking you to fix this thing. Here are the dates by which I'd like you to do it. And here is the letter or the written communication that I'm giving to you to fix this. So what that does is it provides it in writing so that you're not going back and forth about who said what when someone did a phone call or I saw the repair guy passing in the hallway. So it helps to bring some clarity to the process. And that's really more important than the deduction of monies. It's really part of that communication process and having some written documentation behind you to help clarify that communication and hopefully get both parties to the table to do what's needed to create a habitable unit.
Sheila, thank you so much for that. And I know Scott Britton is the attorney, but thanks to my civil procedure class, there is a right to preserve those communications. So for all the landlords and renters out there, that communication, you cannot get rid of it. So if you are provided a note, a text message, you have to save it. And if you don't, and you were found to have done that in bad faith, there could be an instruction that the non-preservance of that communication goes in the other person's favor. So you have to preserve that information. So just to put that out there. The next question we had submitted, did I get that right, Commissioner Britton?
So I took civil procedure 38 years ago. Larry, how long ago for you? So I have no clue.
My final's tomorrow, so I just literally was.
Well, you're definitely more aware of it than I am.
Perfect. No, there is a right to preserve. So the next question we had submitted is, will the ordinance address what will happen after the moratorium? After the moratorium is lifted? Commissioner Britton.
So as we've discussed, the landlord tenant ordinance as we've passed it was pre-COVID and pre-moratorium. So it really deals with a lot of issues that are not so much related to the crisis that's been created by the pandemic. there are some provisions that are relevant regarding pay to stay and those types of things. But the moratorium, I think, is going to be a different animal. And I think it's going to be significant. And Larry has referred to this. And I was on the subcommittee that came up with the Cook County Legal Aid for Housing and Debt group. They're going to be in charge of figuring out a way that if you haven't been able to pay rent for 6 months and all of a sudden the moratorium is lifted, that's going to be a big problem. And there's going to be a homelessness issue and a tsunami of evictions. The Cook County has put in place a system by where we're going to have mediation services, the ability to get lawyers like Larry to represent you and other groups and pro bono attorneys. So we'll be able to help you, I think, in that category. That's going to be a little different than the tenant landlord ordinance, but there'll be some provisions that those lawyers will be able to represent you without cost to you, will be able to help you. And that's what we're hoping for whenever those moratoriums are lifted.
Thank you so much for that, Commissioner Britton. I saw another question come in that clarified something I spoke to earlier. Can you clarify about move-in fees, and did you state that it must be in writing? Oh, sorry, I think I froze for a minute. Hopefully you heard it all. So the question was, can you clarify more about move-in fees? Did you state it must be in writing? So a landlord can require move-in fees, but what they must do is provide a rough estimate of what those move-in fees were used for. For example, say that your tenant is moving in and they're moving in at an hour where you don't usually have a security guard, but because that is your process, you have to bring one on or what have you. That would be something you could add on. Does anyone want to add anything else in terms of move-in fees and the requirements from the ordinance?
I'll just add that what is being requested is reasonable costs that are associated with actually moving in. So Kevin had a good example, Commissioner Kevin had a good example of hiring a security guard, getting an extra dumpster if that's a process that you use when people move in. Now, recarpeting the hallway because it's a little messy after people move in, that is a building improvement fee, and that's something that wouldn't really be related to a move-in cost. That's more about using that as a capital improvement for your building. So we're really talking about the kinds of costs that are affiliated with move-in fee, with moving in for a specific tenant, and that wouldn't be covered by the previous tenant's security deposit if there was damage. So there's there's a way to what we're asking for is a reasonable list of what those fees might entail, or what the kinds of fees that they are, so that people have a sense of what they're being charged for. So that's it, and that's what I have to say about it. I don't know if anyone else wants to pipe in there.
Well, I wanted to say one thing. I think what the ordinance is trying to protect against is landlords thinking, I want to collect a security deposit, but I don't want to have to return the security deposit. And we've seen that happen where landlords will say, well, the move-in fee is $500, and they don't say why it's $500. The reason they want a move-in fee is because you don't have to return it. So again, as the commissioner was saying, as Sheila was saying, it's fine to charge a move-in fee if it reflects a legitimate expense that you incurred during the move-in process. You can't just impose a move-in fee because you're trying to collect money that you don't want to have to return.
Thank you for that. No, I appreciate it. We had another question come in for a clarification. This was on the portion about tenants' right to know concerning utilities and utility shutoff. This is under circumstances when the landlord is providing those utility services. And so the actual requirement is that after a 12-month period, the landlord is required to give information concerning the cost of those utilities during the year that were paid. And if they are going to be shutting off the tenant's utilities for one reason or another, they also have to provide them notice. The landlord doesn't pertain to any additional requirements that would fall on municipalities. And then the next question we're going to move into was also a pre-submitted question. I am interested in the enforceability of the ordinance. How are renters going to be made aware of their rights? What do renters do if they are unfairly forcibly evicted? What responsibilities do landlords have to make renters whole if a renter incur damages due to a violation of the ordinance by a landlord? I think that's a fantastic question. This gets at the heart of a lot of that's contained in this ordinance. Lawrence, can you answer this question about how tenants should handle these situations and what resources are available?
Sure. I think the first part of the question was how tenants are going to be informed about their rights. And there is a requirement that they be provided with a summary of the ordinance. And there are penalties if the landlord fails to provide them with a summary of the ordinance, so they know what their basic rights are. And then really the only way to enforce your rights if the landlord is violating ordinance provisions is to take them to court. And one reason that the ordinance authorizes the award of attorney's fees in these cases, if the tenant can establish a violation, is to ensure that there will be attorneys who are willing to take these cases, because many of these cases will be brought by low-income families who can't afford a retainer, they can't afford to pay the attorney up front. And the only way these attorneys will be motivated to take these cases is if they realize that they can collect their fees if they prevail on a meritorious claim. So again, I would just urge anybody who believes that their rights have been violated to at least consult with an attorney and to get some advice. But the ordinance does a great job of ensuring that tenants can enforce their rights and remedies under the ordinance by going to court and by providing a way for tenants to encourage attorneys to represent them in these cases. There was one other question about what to do if you are wrongfully evicted. I assume that that question is asking about a lockout. Again, if you are the victim of a lockout, and lockouts are strictly prohibited, and there are stiff penalties for violating the prohibition against lockouts, the first thing that you should do is contact the police and report this. And the police should help you and should contact the landlord and force the landlord to restore you to possession of your unit. It is good when you call the police if you have with you some evidence that you actually are a tenant, maybe a piece of mail or a telephone bill, to show that you live at the unit. It's also important, I would say, to get the names of the police officers and their badge numbers, know what precinct they're coming from, in case the police don't offer assistance, because some police are under the misapprehension that these are civil matters that the police should not get involved in, and that's just not the case. And if you have the information about the police officers who did not assist you, that can often be corrected, usually if an attorney on your behalf calls the watch commander. And again, if you are not able to get the landlord to voluntarily restore you to possession of the unit, you can sue the landlord, and a court will order the landlord to restore you to possession of the unit. And the court may also impose a financial penalty against the landlord and award you money damages and your attorney's fees. So the great thing about the ordinance is it has a lot of teeth, and I think that when landlords realize what penalties they'd be subjecting themselves to by violating the prohibition against lockouts, they will follow the law.
Thank you so much for that, Lawrence. I saw another question come in that correlates with the discussion on moratoriums with one question that was pre-submitted. So I'll read the pre-submitted question and answer it accordingly. This one says, Sheriff deputies, when will they resume evictions? I have an order of possession from January 2020. this was something that several people asked. I believe the state's moratorium is set to expire May 1st, but that is continuously being updated from month to month. The federal deadline is June 30th. But in the meantime, the county has been working with tenant and landlords to get back rent paid through the county's rental assistance program. I know we just finished another application process for rental assistance. There's also the potential opportunities with the next batch of federal relief that will be coming into the county that also could assist renters in making up their past rent. Does anyone else want to jump in on this issue if there's anything I missed? Good.
Good.
Perfect. We also had a question concerning whether or not pet fees are still allowed. Sheila, do you want to talk on that one?
As far as I understand, there's no prohibition. I don't think the ordinance at all addresses pet fees.
It does not. You still can charge a pet fee.
Perfect. Thank you. The next question I want to go to is what is the effect of the ordinance on security deposits and notices given for leases entered into prior to 6/1 or when it goes into effect June 1st? Lawrence, would you like to address this question?
Sure. We had talked about this a little bit. My feeling is that once the ordinance goes into effect, the landlords have to comply with all of its provisions, even if some provisions of a lease agreement that was signed before the ordinance went into effect conflict with the ordinance provisions. Once the ordinance goes into effect, I believe that it applies to all existing lease agreements.
Perfect. Sorry.
I just want to address a couple of things about security deposit really quickly, since we just are on that subject. So one of the things to note about the county ordinance is that it does not require payment of interest on security deposits. So that's no longer, that was in the Chicago ordinance and it's not in the Cook County ordinance. It may exist in some other localities ordinances as well, but it does not exist in the Cook County ordinance. So I just wanted to address that. And additionally, the requirement is that the security deposit be held in a bank account, but it doesn't have to be held in a separate interest-bearing bank account. So just to clarify a couple of those issues about security deposits, that if people are familiar with other ordinances, the Cook County ordinance in terms of security deposits just has those, is really focused on making sure that that we know where the money is and that it gets returned, and not really focused on those. We wanted to make sure we were clear on those kind of wackadoodle, 2-cent interest charges that really weren't effective in doing anything helpful for anyone.
And
Right.
Kevin, I can also
that-
say there was one other thing I wanted. I saw a couple of comments that this is going to prevent people from investing in suburban Cook County rental properties, and there's going to be a catastrophic effect on landlords. The provisions we have here are basic human rights, where you have a place that's safe, that has heat and air conditioning. If that has the air conditioning, these are not outrageous impositions. And by the way, this ordinance is less onerous in many ways than the City of Chicago ordinance. And my understanding is that there are still people renting apartments in the city of Chicago. So as I have dealt with this type of issue in my government service over the last 20 years, people always have a tendency to be a little bit overreactive to what's really going to happen. I think that the good landlords are already doing all this. The bad landlords are going to stop doing some of the bad stuff. And a few are going to be spanked a little bit by some of these provisions, and they probably deserve to be. But it's not going to affect, I believe, the vast majority of the good landlords who are just trying to run a business in suburban Cook County and will continue to be able to do so.
And I do think that the Cook County ordinance has some advantages to the Chicago ordinance. I did talk about the interest rates on security deposits, and I probably shouldn't have, because the Cook County ordinance doesn't require landlords to pay interest on those deposits. But that provision does exist in the Chicago ordinance, and it was important when the Chicago ordinance was enacted back in 1986 because the interest rate was significant. It was 5%. It's now extremely low. I think it's 0.01%. And I think that it was very smart of everyone who enacted this ordinance to get rid of the interest provision, because that could only be used at this point, really, to unfairly punish landlords who miscalculated the tiny amount of a deposit that was due on a security deposit. And as Sheila said, I think that the Cook County Ordinance focuses on what's important, ensuring that the security deposit itself is returned when it needs to be, and that landlords only withhold from this deposit unpaid rent or the cost of repairing damage that exceeds ordinary wear and tear.
Thank you for that, Lawrence. I'm going to send this question next off to Commissioner Britton as well. We had a pre-submitted question in line with this as well. So this was, if the security deposit rules go into effect on 6/1/21 for a lease entered prior to 6/1/21, is a owner-occupied 2-unit property exempt? The ordinance says I am only exempt if I disclose that fact in the advertising materials and application. I didn't know the ordinance existed, say, in September 2020. If you want to address this, Commissioner Britton, and then also if you could address the effect that this might have on leases that were initiated prior to June 1st.
So I do recognize that landlords are not able to go back in time and give you a notice that didn't exist before the effective date of the statute. So I certainly understand that. I don't mean to be flippant, but some of this is common sense. No, you don't have to give notice of something that didn't exist. Now, I think that, a lot of these provisions relate to the institution of a new lease. That's why a lot of these provisions are going to be governed by how you're going to give, when you renew, or if you have a new lease term after June 1st. A lot of the other provisions, certainly could be argued on the health and safety issues. Certainly on the lockout issue apply immediately. But I do believe that it's designed specifically to address these issues going forward. That's why we gave so much time for the effective date, postponing it from January to June 1. And that's going to be an important part of how we proceed with this going forward, so that we do deal fairly with everybody who's involved.
Also, to the question that was asked, it's very clearly written in the ordinance that the question says, is an owner occupied 2-unit property exempt? The answer to that is yes. It's written in the ordinance. It's one of the first exemptions, that if you're in an owner occupied building that is 6 units or less, or if you own 1 unit, only one other unit, and you or a family member has lived there in the past year, that you are exempt from the ordinance. So it's very clearly stated in the ordinance that your building, in this example, would be exempt.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Sheila. We had a question from Christina. Is Section 42801D of the RTLO intended to effectively preempt home rule municipalities from regulating the tenant-landlord relationship? That portion of the ordinance is not meant to preempt municipalities. So, for example, Chicago, Evanston, Mount Prospect, their current RTLOs remain in effect, and those are the policies that are applicable in those communities. One of the reasons why we push forward this policy to begin with, I live in Mount Prospect. I have rights as a prospective renter that most of my residents here in the 15th district did not have. Same goes for Commissioner Britton. Now, what it does require is that there are certain standards that the municipality has to abide by that effectively put these protections in place. But no, municipalities can create their own RTLOs, and those would go into effect. And then let's see. Another question that we had come in was, why aren't landlords and management companies held responsible and accountable when they violate the RTLO, even when elected officials are made aware of their negligence? I want to thank whoever submitted this question. I believe the person is referring to the city's RLTO. Commissioner Britton, can you speak on how tenants can approach an issue they are having under this new ordinance to try to avoid some of these issues?
So, and again, we're not relying on the sheriff's office or the human rights department of the county to enforce this ordinance. It is based on a private cause of action. Larry's pointed it out, I think, very correctly. The reason that this is going to be enforced and the mechanism by which it's going to be done is not government regulation. It's going to be private action. And lawyers will be more willing to take these cases if there is provision to allow for attorney's fees for the tenants. That is why I believe it is something that can be enforced, and you're not going to have to rely on the sheriff or your elected officials or anyone else. You can call one of those legal aid companies that Larry pointed out at the end of the presentation, and they will be able to guide you and they'll take your case because there'll be an incentive for them to do so.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Britton. We're past the hour, and so I know we have to finish up. For those who submitted questions that we weren't able to address today, please send those questions either to my office or to Commissioner Britton's. I want to thank everyone for watching and participating. I'm going to allow everyone to do some final words and final thoughts. So why don't we begin with you, Lawrence?
Let me just unmute myself. I will just say that I'm thrilled that this ordinance was passed and is going into effect in June. Because, as I mentioned before, sometimes we would get a call from a client who lived in suburban Cook County who was complaining about excessive late fees or complaining about being locked out or complaining about being the victim of a retaliatory eviction. And we would think, oh my God, if only this person lived in Chicago or in Evanston or Mount Prospect, it would be a much better case because they have more rights and remedies under local landlord-tenant ordinances. And now that the Cook County ordinance is going into effect, everyone in Cook County will have these additional protections. Obviously, the Cook County ordinance does not apply in Chicago, Evanston, Mount Prospect, because they already have their own ordinances, but everybody else is going to be protected. And I know how important the Chicago, Evanston, Mount Prospect ordinances have been. I know how much they have improved housing conditions and prevented lockouts and retaliatory actions. And so I'm very excited that now all of these protections are being extended to everyone throughout Cook County.
So I'll go next. I'd just like to thank everybody for allowing Housing Action to be a part of the process and have this conversation. I did want to note that we did everything that we could, I think, to engage with the landlord and realtor constituency through various processes. We spent a lot of hours together going line by line over the ordinance. Everyone got a little bit of what they wanted, and some people didn't go, like we all didn't get some of the things that we wanted. And one thing that I wanted to mention is there, aside from those small landlord cutouts that we talked about, the six units or less owner occupied, the one additional property that you own that you've lived in for the past year exemption. We also worked with the industry to add a 2 business day right to cure for some of those notices that we're asking landlords to provide to tenants, so that if you you make a mistake and you forget to provide that notice, that you have 2 full business days to cure that once you've been made aware of it. So I just wanted to point out that I think there is a lot of room here to work together, and we understand that the relationship between tenant and landlord should be one of mutual respect and cooperation, and that's something that we think the ordinance can provide because it provides a better footing for both parties. And finally, I just wanted to mention that there also is mediation money, mediation services, I should say, that were provided for by some of the federal money. So if you are having issues with eviction issues and other kinds of issues, check with your local municipality to see if there's access to services for mediation. Just as a note, we can all work together. So I just wanted to say that, and thank you all for your time.
Thank you so much, Sheila. I'll go next, and then let Commissioner Britton finish us off for the evening. I just want to thank Laura and Sheila for participating this evening and taking the time. Thank you to everyone who viewed and participated and asked questions. We will try to get answers to all the questions that we weren't able to address. Now, the goal at heart is to do whatever is within our being to keep people housed. When people are evicted, that helps perpetuate and lead to a growing unstably housed population within the county. Of course, this ordinance means that renters still have to pay their rent that is due. And so it is important that now we have these type of relationships codified, both the responsibilities of a renter and of a landlord. And I think that we're going to see some great good come out of this in the months ahead. I'm excited for this going into full effect June 1st. Again, thank you all for taking part this evening. And last but not least, Commissioner Britton.
Thank you, Kevin. This process started for me because a group of people in unincorporated Glenview were having some very significant problems with an out-of-state landlord. And I had one woman in her 70s who was on oxygen, whose air conditioner wasn't working, and she could get no response from her landlord. And I thought that was not acceptable. That is why Kevin and I worked on this so hard to put this in place to level the playing field, which quite honestly was not fair in many respects for tenants. At the same time, understanding, and I have friends of mine who own rental properties, we're not trying to make this any more difficult than it has to be, but there's a certain fairness that has to be put in place. And I'll also leave with the people who have been concerned about some of the functioning of this ordinance. Both Kevin and I are more than willing to listen to anything that needs to be changed. We have the ability to alter and to revise provisions within the ordinance if they're not working properly. That is something that we'd be more than happy to listen to address, and to change if it seems appropriate. So again, I want to thank especially all of the housing advocates, the landlord groups, the realtors, and of course, Kevin and my staff who did such a wonderful job putting this together, and Larry and Sheila for being here tonight, and the president's leadership. It has been truly something that has made me feel good about government, that I think we can get this done with a 17-0 vote, Kevin, as you remember. So it was not something that I think we can take some justifiable pride in, and we look forward to it being official June 1. So thanks to everybody.